You canceled the plans tonight. Maybe you said you were tired. Maybe you just did not respond to the message at all. And somewhere in the silence that followed, in the space between the obligation you stepped away from and the familiar guilt that arrived immediately after, something else was also present, something quieter than the guilt. A relief so specific and so physical that it surprised you a little. The particular quality of an exhale that can only happen when no one is watching, when no performance is required, when the door is closed and the evening is yours, and there is genuinely nothing you need to be for anyone in this moment. Most people do not know what to do with that relief, because the culture they are living in has a very clear position on it. That relief is laziness. That relief is avoidance. That relief is the feeling of someone who is falling behind, withdrawing from life, failing to show up in the ways that matter. And so the guilt that arrives alongside it is not random. It is trained, the product of a very consistent message, delivered across years in 100 different forms, that your worth is measured by your presence, your accessibility, your willingness to remain available and engaged and outward-facing, even when everything inside you is signaling that it needs something different. Carl Jung spent his career examining what happens when that signal is consistently overridden, what accumulates in the psyche of a person who never allows themselves the particular quality of inward rest, that staying home, genuinely staying home, not performing relaxation while remaining psychologically available to everything external, actually makes possible. And what he found was not what the culture's message about productivity and connection would suggest. He found that the people who never withdrew, who maintained constant outward presence and constant social engagement and constant availability to the demands of the external world, did not become more whole through that availability. They became less whole, gradually, invisibly, in a way that accumulated below the level of conscious awareness until it expressed itself in forms that seemed to have nothing to do with the simple fact of never having given the inner life the space it needed. This video is about what that space actually contains, what happens inside you, not metaphorically, not aspirationally, but in the specific and documentable way that Jung observed across decades of clinical practice, when you stop performing availability and simply allow yourself to be home. Jung introduced a concept that most people encounter in simplified form and then set aside, believing they have understood it. He called it the persona. The persona is the social mask, the set of characteristics, behaviors, and presentations that a person develops in response to what their environment consistently requires. And in its simplified form, the concept seems obvious enough. Of course, people behave differently in different social contexts. Of course, there is a version of you that exists for professional settings, and a version for close friendships, and a version for family gatherings. This is not revelation. This is ordinary social competence. But Jung was pointing towards something more specific and more significant than the ordinary observation that people code switch. He was pointing toward what happens to the energy required to maintain the persona across the full length of a social day. Because the persona is not passive. It is active, continuously and effortfully active. Every adjustment of tone to match the room's expectation, every suppression of a genuine reaction that would be inappropriate in this particular context, every performance of engagement when the actual inner state is closer to exhaustion, every word chosen for its social acceptability rather than its honesty. All of this consumes what Jung called psychic energy, the finite resource of inner vitality that is available to a person at any given time, and it consumes it at a rate that most people, because the consumption is so constant and so normalized, have stopped being able to feel as consumption. They feel only the end result, the specific quality of depletion that arrives at the end of a day in which they were, by every external measure, entirely present. And they attribute it to the day's tasks, to the work completed, the problems solved, the meetings attended, when in fact, a significant portion of what depleted them was something the tasks had nothing to do with. It was the continuous maintenance of the version of themselves that the day required, the persona, working without pause, consuming resources that were never replenished, because the space in which replenishment could occur, the space where the persona is no longer required, was never entered. When you close the door and the evening belongs to no one but yourself, the first thing that begins to happen is almost imperceptible. The persona starts to lower, not all at once, not with any drama or visible transition. But gradually, as the social requirements recede and the necessity of managing your presentation to an audience dissolves, something in the psyche that has been held at a particular level of activation begins to release. Most people, in the early stages of this release, experience it as a strange flatness. Not peace exactly, not the warm, comfortable relaxation that the cultural image of staying home suggests. Something more neutral and more honest than that. The flatness of a system that has been running at a sustained elevation and is now, for the first time in hours, allowed to return to its actual baseline. Below the flatness, if a person stays with it rather than immediately filling it with something, a screen, a conversation, any of the ready supply of inputs that modern life makes continuously available, something else begins to emerge, a quality of inner signal that was present all day but inaudible beneath the noise of the social performance. The genuine tiredness that the performed energy was covering, the actual feelings, not the managed versions, not the processed for appropriateness versions, but the raw and unedited versions of the day's encounters, the specific thoughts that could not complete themselves during the hours when the external world was demanding continuous response. Jung believed this emergence was not incidental. It was the purpose of the withdrawal. The psyche, given the conditions that make it possible, does something that the constantly socially engaged psyche cannot do. It speaks, not in language exactly, in the form of feelings that arise without needing to be explained to anyone, in the form of thoughts that complete themselves without needing to be calibrated for audience, in the form of a quality of inner presence that is simply, honestly, without performance, whatever it actually is. There is a specific part of the psyche that Jung paid particular attention to in the context of withdrawal. He called it the shadow, and in its full meaning, not the simplified version that popular psychology has made of it. It is one of the most practically important concepts he developed. The shadow is not the evil part of a person. It is not the collection of shameful impulses and dark desires that the moral self must keep under control. It is something more ordinary and more significant than that. It is everything that could not be included in the persona, every quality, emotion, desire, fear, and genuine reaction that did not fit the version of yourself that your environment, family, culture, professional context, social circle, required you to present. The anger that was not acceptable in the environments where you formed your sense of what was acceptable. The grief that had no space to be fully felt because life kept moving and stopping to feel it was not an available option. The need for recognition that was suppressed because expressing it directly conflicted with the image of self-sufficiency that was expected or admired. The creative impulse, the unconventional desire, the genuine preference that conflicted too sharply with what the people around you valued. All of this went somewhere. It did not disappear. It went into the shadow, and from the shadow, it continues to influence, in ways that the person experiencing the influence cannot easily trace to their source. The quality of their daily emotional experience, the patterns of their reactions, the recurring shape of their difficulties. The shadow does not wait patiently. It speaks when the conditions allow it, and the conditions that allow it most reliably are precisely the conditions that staying home, genuinely, without the constant input of external demand, creates. The quieting of the social performance, the absence of the audience that the persona is calibrated for. The simple, unglamorous fact of being present with whatever is actually present in the inner life, without the continuous distraction of what the outer world is requiring. Most people, when the shadow begins to speak in these conditions, experience it as a problem. The sadness that arrives without obvious cause on a quiet evening. The restlessness that surfaces when there is nothing that must be done. The old memory that returns without being summoned. The uncomfortable feeling whose origin cannot be immediately located. The standard response to these experiences, the culturally endorsed response, is to treat them as symptoms of something going wrong. To fill the quiet that produced them with something that will push them back down. To reach for the phone, the television, the conversation, the plan, any of the ready supply of external inputs that will redirect the attention outward and restore the familiar state of managed, organized, outward-facing engagement. Jung's understanding of what these experiences actually are is profoundly different from this response. He did not see the sadness without obvious cause as dysfunction. He saw it as the shadow finding the conditions in which it could finally be heard. He did not see the restlessness as a problem to be solved. He saw it as the psyche signaling the presence of something that had been waiting for exactly this quality of quiet to make itself known. He did not see the old memory returning as random noise. He saw it as the unconscious presenting material that had been insufficiently processed, insufficiently integrated into the conscious understanding of the self, and that was being offered, in this rare moment of genuine quiet, another opportunity for that integration to occur. The crucial point Jung made, and it is a point that transforms the experience of staying home when it is genuinely understood, is this: what surfaces in the quiet is not being created by the quiet. It was already there. It was there all along, running beneath the social performance, influencing the quality of experience in ways that could not be consciously perceived, because the perception was always occupied by the demands of the outer world. The quiet does not produce these things. It simply creates the conditions under which they can finally be noticed. And what can be noticed can, in a way that what operates invisibly cannot, be engaged with. Understood, integrated, allowed to contribute to a richer and more honest sense of who the person actually is, rather than continuing to operate from the shadow, shaping experience without the person's knowledge or consent. Jung wrote about what he called individuation with a precision that gets lost in popular summaries of his work. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not the achievement of a better, more functional, more socially successful version of yourself. It is something more fundamental and less comfortable than either of those. It is the process of becoming, as fully as possible, who you actually are. Not who the persona has been shaped to be, not who the social environment has consistently rewarded you for performing, not the version of yourself that has been assembled, piece by piece, from the feedback of others about what version of you they found most acceptable, or most useful, or most easy to be around, but who you actually are, with all the complexity and contradiction and inconvenient specificity that genuine selfhood contains. Jung believed this process, the genuine version of it, not the performance of personal development, was not possible without periods of withdrawal, without the specific conditions that genuine inward turning creates. The conditions under which the persona is not required, the shadow can surface, and the genuine self, whatever it actually is, independent of what it has been shaped to perform, has the space to become perceptible. This is what he meant when he spoke of staying home not as escape from life, but as a return to it. A return to the version of life that exists below the performance, below the continuous social management, below the accumulation of roles and expectations and calibrated presentations that constitute daily existence in the social world. A return to something that was present before any of that began. That has been present all along, beneath it, and that can only be encountered, genuinely, not in the imagined way, but in the actual lived experience of encountering it, in the specific conditions that withdrawal from social performance creates. The practical reality of this is quieter than the language used to describe it suggests. It does not feel like revelation. It does not produce, in most cases, dramatic insight or sudden clarity, or the sense of transformation that people who have read about psychological development tend to expect. It feels, mostly, like an evening at home, with whatever that actually contains. The particular quality of your own company, which is different from the company of anyone else, and which most people have not spent enough time with to know well. The specific texture of your own thoughts when they are not being organized for external consumption. The honest quality of your own tiredness, or restlessness, or the feeling that does not quite have a name, but that is genuinely present when everything that was covering it has temporarily receded. This is not nothing. Jung would argue, it is among the most significant experiences available to a human being. Not because of what it produces immediately, but because of what it begins, slowly and cumulatively, to make possible. A relationship with your own inner life that is not primarily mediated by what the outer world requires of it. A sense of self that does not depend, for its stability, on continuous external confirmation. A capacity for genuine rest, not the performed rest of someone who is sitting still while remaining psychologically available to everything external, but the actual rest of a psyche that has been given permission, for this evening, to simply be whatever it actually is. This is what happens when you stay home and do nothing. Not nothing, the most important something. Finally given the space it has been waiting for. There is a specific quality of attention that becomes available in genuine solitude that is not available anywhere else. Not in meditation exactly, though meditation can approach it. Not in sleep, though sleep does something adjacent to it. Not even in the most intimate conversation, because conversation, however close, is always also a social event, always also involving the management of how you are being received. The quality of attention that becomes available when you are genuinely alone, when there is no audience, real or imagined, whose presence is shaping what you allow yourself to notice, is something Jung returned to repeatedly in his clinical observations. He called it, in various formulations, the capacity to hear oneself. Not the performed self, not the self that is continuously organized around what it is producing for others, the self that exists prior to any of that. The one that was present before the first social role was assumed, that has been present throughout, beneath every role, every performance, every carefully calibrated presentation. And that can be encountered, not imagined, not described, but actually encountered, only when the performances have temporarily ceased. Most people have had brief experiences of this quality of attention, without knowing what it was, a moment of genuine stillness that arrived unexpectedly. A quality of inner clarity that appeared in the space between one obligation and the next. A sense, fleeting and difficult to hold, of being present with something that felt more genuinely like themselves than the ordinary experience of moving through their social day. These moments are not accidents. They are the self, making itself briefly perceptible in whatever gaps the social performance momentarily allows. What staying home makes possible, genuinely staying home, without immediately filling the space with equivalent demands, is the extension of those gaps. The creation of conditions in which the self can be not just briefly glimpsed, but actually stayed with, long enough to become familiar, long enough to begin providing the kind of orientation that Jung believed was the only reliable foundation for a life lived from the inside, rather than performed for the outside. Jung paid close attention to what he called intuition, not in the colloquial sense of a vague feeling or an unfounded hunch, in the precise psychological sense of a mode of perception that operates through the unconscious rather than through the sequential logic of rational thought. Intuition, as Jung understood it, is not irrational. It is differently rational. It draws on the accumulated experience of a lifetime, on patterns recognized and comparisons made and connections perceived, but does so below the level of conscious deliberation. It arrives not as an argument, but as a knowing, not as a conclusion reached through steps, but as a perception that is simply present. And it is one of the most practically useful capacities available to a human being, Jung believed, precisely because it has access to information that the rational mind, operating as it does through conscious deliberation, cannot fully process. The problem is that intuition is easily drowned out. It is not loud. It does not interrupt or insist or compete successfully with the continuous noise of social demand. It speaks in the register of a quiet inner signal, a sense of rightness or wrongness, alignment or misalignment, a pull toward or away from something, that requires a quality of inner quiet to be perceptible at all. When the social performance is continuously running, that quiet is not available. The signal is present, but the noise level of the social environment, the continuous demands on attention, the management of impressions, the processing of others' emotional states, the calibration of responses, makes the signal effectively inaudible. It is only when that noise recedes, when the evening is quiet and the door is closed and nothing is required, that the signal becomes audible. That the intuition, which has been registering things all day that the social performance did not have bandwidth to receive, can finally communicate what it has been holding. This is one of the most practically significant things that happens when you stay home, and, in the cultural sense of the phrase, do nothing. You are not doing nothing. You are creating the conditions under which one of your most important perceptual faculties can finally speak. And the person who has spent enough time in genuine solitude, who has developed enough of a relationship with their own inner quiet to recognize the specific quality of an intuitive signal when it arrives, has access to a form of guidance that the perpetually socially engaged person, however intelligent and however self-aware, cannot reliably access. Because the information was always present, but the conditions for receiving it were never created. There is a paradox at the center of what this video is describing that deserves to be named directly. The people who most need the withdrawal, who are carrying the most accumulated weight of unprocessed shadow material, who have the most depleted psychic energy, who have the greatest need for the specific conditions that genuine solitude creates, are often the people who find it most difficult to allow themselves. Because the mechanism that has produced the depletion is the same mechanism that generates the guilt when the withdrawal is attempted. The person whose worth has been organized around their availability cannot easily permit themselves to be unavailable without the immediate arrival of the familiar signal that something is wrong, that they are failing, that they are selfish, that the relief they feel is evidence of inadequacy, rather than evidence of a psyche that has been giving beyond its capacity for long enough that genuine rest has become genuinely necessary. The guilt is not random. It is the persona defending itself, because the persona, the social mask that has been organized around availability and responsiveness and continuous presence, is genuinely threatened by the withdrawal, not in any dramatic sense, but in the simple sense that the persona requires the social environment in order to function. It needs an audience, and the moment you close the door and the audience is removed, the persona's authority over what you do with your time and energy becomes suddenly much weaker. And the part of the psyche that has been organized around the persona's requirements, that has internalized the external demands so completely that they now feel like internal values, generates the guilt as a mechanism for restoring the conditions that the persona requires. Jung understood this dynamic with precision. He had observed it in too many people and had lived through his own version of it with sufficient depth to mistake the guilt for a reliable moral signal. It is not a reliable moral signal. It is the sound of a structure that has been in charge for a long time, encountering a genuine challenge to its authority. And like all structures whose authority is being challenged, it responds with the tools available to it. In this case, the tools that social conditioning has most thoroughly installed: guilt, shame, the persistent sense that you are falling short of what is required. The invitation, when this arrives, is not to argue with it, not to reason your way out of it, or to reassure yourself that it is wrong, but simply to notice it, to recognize it as the persona doing what the persona does when the conditions that sustain it are withdrawn. And to stay with the withdrawal anyway, not in defiance, in the simple understanding that what is generating the guilt is not a reliable guide to what is actually needed. Jung's clinical observations across decades produced a consistent finding that he found both significant and sobering. The people who never withdrew, who maintained the social performance without interruption, who never created the conditions in which the shadow could surface or the inner self could speak, did not live better lives for their continuous engagement. They lived more defended lives. Lives organized, with increasing sophistication over time, around not encountering what the withdrawal would have made visible, around not feeling what the quiet would have allowed to surface, around maintaining, at whatever cost, the familiar structure of outward engagement that kept the inner life at a manageable distance. And the cost, accumulated across years, was specific, not dramatic, not the sudden collapse that the cultural narrative about breakdown suggests. A gradual, almost imperceptible narrowing of the inner life, a progressive loss of access to the aspects of the self that had been consistently excluded from the persona. A growing sense, rarely articulated because rarely examined, that the life being lived was correct by every external measure and yet was not, in some fundamental sense, the person's own. That the efficiency and the capability and the consistent social presence had been purchased at a price that was difficult to name, but that was nonetheless real. Jung called this state the state of a person who has become so thoroughly identified with their social role that they have lost access to the self beneath it, the greatest danger of the persona. Not the mask itself, the forgetting that it is a mask. The gradual, unconscious process by which the performed version of the self displaces the actual version so completely that the actual version is no longer experienced as something that exists. Withdrawal is the antidote to this. Not dramatic withdrawal. Not permanent withdrawal. Not the romantic fantasy of leaving everything behind and starting over somewhere else. The ordinary, recurring, genuinely necessary withdrawal of an evening at home, where nothing is required, where the mask is not needed, where whatever is actually present, whatever has been accumulating beneath the social surface of the day, has the conditions to surface, be noticed, and begin the slow process of integration into a self that is gradually becoming more complete. What does the integration actually feel like from the inside? Not in the idealized version, not the dramatic insight or the transformative breakthrough that the language of psychological development can sometimes suggest. In the honest, ordinary, lived version, it feels, mostly, like a gradual change in the quality of your own company. A slow development of something that resembles familiarity with your own inner state. Not comfort exactly, because the inner state is not always comfortable, and part of what integration requires is the willingness to be present with what is uncomfortable, rather than immediately converting it into something more manageable. But something like recognition, the growing capacity to notice what is actually present in your inner experience at any given moment, not what should be present, not what you would prefer to be present, not the managed, processed, socially calibrated version of what is present, what is actually there. And to receive it, however inconvenient, however much it conflicts with the image you maintain of who you are, as genuine information about the self, as something worth attending to, as the specific, irreplaceable, entirely individual voice of a psyche that has something to contribute to your understanding of your own life, if it is given the conditions in which it can speak. Jung believed this. The development of a genuine relationship with your own inner experience was the foundation of everything else he considered important about psychological development, not the content of the insights, not the specific things that surface in the quiet. The capacity for honest self-encounter that the quiet, practiced over time, develops. Because a person who has that capacity, who has spent enough time in genuine solitude to become genuinely familiar with their own inner life, brings something qualitatively different to everything else they do. They bring someone who is actually there, not a persona, performing presence while remaining psychologically elsewhere, not a social role, executing its functions while the genuine self waits somewhere in the background for conditions that allow it to emerge. In the specific, embodied, fully inhabited sense that only becomes possible when the person has enough of a relationship with their own inner life to bring it, rather than the performance of it, into contact with the world. The world does not lose anything when you stay home. This is the thing that the guilt insists is not true, but that genuine reflection, the kind that only becomes available in the conditions that staying home creates, consistently reveals. The world does not become poorer for your periodic withdrawal from its demands. The relationships in your life do not suffer from the evenings you spend in genuine solitude, rather than performing connection you do not currently have the resources to genuinely offer. The work does not deteriorate because you have allowed the part of you that produces it to rest in a way that actually replenishes, rather than simply repositions the depletion. What the world receives from a person who has spent sufficient time in genuine withdrawal, who has developed a real relationship with their own inner life, who brings a self rather than a persona to their encounters, is something that the perpetually available, perpetually performing person cannot reliably provide. Genuine presence, the specific quality of being actually there, with the full weight and specificity and honest individuality of a self that has been given enough space to become real. Jung believed that this, genuine presence, arising from a genuine self that has been genuinely encountered, was the most significant contribution any person could make to any relationship, any work, any form of engagement with the world. Not the performance of engagement, the actual thing. And the actual thing requires, as its necessary condition, exactly what this video began with: the evening at home, the closed door, the relief that arrives when the performance is no longer required, and the willingness to stay with what surfaces in that space, however uncomfortable, however unfamiliar, however much it conflicts with the managed version of yourself that the social world has come to expect, long enough for it to contribute to a self that is, gradually and imperfectly, becoming more genuinely its own. This is what happens when you stay home and do nothing. Not nothing. The quiet, invisible, entirely necessary work of becoming more fully yourself, one evening at a time. If something in this gave language to something you have been feeling, but could not quite name, leave one word in the comments that describes what you have been needing permission to protect, because naming it is the first act of protecting it.